Thanks for joining us on the DDS Faith Podcast. Our prayer is that as we discuss what God has to teach us through His Word, we can all learn how to deepen, defend, and share our faith in Jesus Christ. Tonight, we've got a guest on with us. We've got Rabbi Eric Tokajer, and he is a Messianic rabbi, and I'm sure there's many listeners that don't know what that is, so we're going to put Rabbi on the camera, and he's just going to explain a little bit about who he is and what he does. Go ahead, Rabbi.
Okay, the simplest terms, a Messianic rabbi is merely a teacher or what in churches would be considered a pastor or a minister that leads congregations of Jewish people who believe in Yeshua or Jesus as the Messiah. So that's the simplest explanation. I'm a Jewish person. I was raised Jewish. My family is Jewish all the way back as far as records show. And but at the age of 19, I became a believer in Yeshua or Jesus as the Messiah. And then I went to school and so on to become a rabbi. So that's the short version of it.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. So, Messianic meaning the anointed one. It's just the Hebrew word for Messiah.
Right. Mashiach is the Hebrew word for Christios, which means the anointed one.
Yeah.
So that's where it comes from. Yes.
Cool. Now you mentioned that you could trace your family back, like you're legitimate. You're legitimately Jewish. Do you know what tribe you're a part of?
No.
Okay.
Nobody really does. Now, the truth is there are groups that'll sell you these DNA tests. The DNA tests will show whether you have Jewish background, but it doesn't really show tribe except for the Kohanim or the priests. There's a genetic marker for that. But all the other tribes, there's no way to actually tell from DNA right now what tribe you're from.
Gotcha. Okay. Did you have something, Eli?
No.
Oh, you just looked like you had something.
No, I was trying to hold in a yawn.
All right. All right, so tonight...
I bored you already.
So tonight...
In this episode.
Yeah, there you go. Thanks.
There you go.
He knew what I was going to say. So in this episode, we're going to talk about the Passover feast and the holiday that Christians like to celebrate, which is Easter. And I know one of the things that frustrates me as a Christian is just that most Christians almost say that, their beginning started with Jesus, the New Testament. Like, Christianity started 2,000 years ago versus, really I wouldn't even call us an extension of Judaism. We're all one. Like, that's just all part of it. And I want to talk a little bit about Passover because I think there's a lot of people that miss a lot of the things that we see in the Bible. Jesus says, "Do this in remembrance of me." And as Christians, we take the Lord's Supper, we take the bread, and what we do is grape juice. But I kind of want Rabbi to give us kind of a rundown of why should we celebrate the Passover instead of Easter.
Well, I can tell you that for me, understanding the death, burial, and resurrection of Yeshua or Jesus is impossible without understanding why those things matter. We can call it anything we want to, but the reality is that God established these feast days from the very beginning. In Genesis 1, we're told that He established the signs, the stars, the sun, the heavenly bodies in order to establish, and in most Bibles it says appointed times or seasons rather, but the word is moedim, which means appointed times. He established times so that He could establish the appointed times. Then He established the appointed times as precursors or rehearsals for the coming of Messiah. So when you take away those signs, it makes it difficult to find the Messiah and understand who and what He did. So, for instance, the fact that He died on a cross at a certain time only makes sense if you put it into the context of the Passover, and that he died at the same time that the Passover lamb died on that day at that hour. When the high priest, or when Yeshua said, "It is finished," it was the same time that the high priest in the temple would have said, "It is finished," at the culmination of the Passover sacrifice. All of these events were there so that the Jewish people, and ultimately the non-Jewish people who followed them, would be able to identify the coming of Messiah and recognize who he was. And so these days are important, so important that the Lord said these were to be eternal celebrations or observances, and that these observances would go on for forever. And yet in the body of Messiah, among believers today, very few of them actually celebrate these days that God said, "These are my holy days. These are my appointed times." And if he's they're feasts of the Lord. If he's your Lord, then they're your feasts also.
Right.
And the church will very much celebrate things that aren't commanded or expected, and yet not do the ones that are.
Yeah. So with the Passover, I think that was excellent of how you explained that. I know one thing with the Passover, when I was younger and really early in ministry, I got a little confused between what is the Passover exactly? Okay, yeah, we know about it from the Old Testament, and we see, the Jews, they make the Exodus out of Egypt, and before that happens, the plague, God sends the plagues, and then finally, he does the last plague, which is where the firstborn son of each household is going to die, unless they have the blood of the lamb on their door. Now, I know most Christians have heard this. Everybody gets that part. Okay, great. But I don't think they understand what the Feast of Unleavened Bread is and how long Passover actually is. Like, I think a lot of Christians think, oh yeah, it's a whole day, but there's more to the Passover than that. I wanted to see if you could shed a little light on that.
Well, absolutely. Passover is actually just about 3 hours long. We think about the Passover feast, which it's now called and understood to be, but the actual feast of Passover is only between 3 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon of the 14th of Nisan. So it's the time period between the afternoon offering and the evening offering, which is when the Passover lambs were sacrificed. As soon as sun goes down, or sunset, then we begin the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The Feast of Unleavened Bread is 7 days long. And so you have the first day through the 8th day of Passover. And then in the middle of that, on the day that Yeshua would have resurrected, which was not a Sunday, but the day of Yom HaBikurim, or first fruits, which is the day of the first fruits, which happens to be the same day he resurrected. So all of these events that happened during this, his death, burial, and resurrection, all happened at the times when the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of First Fruits, and the Feast of Passover were taking place, perfectly aligned with the events of Passover.
Yeah, and, I think it's incredible just, how God knew every single bit that was going to happen. I mean, Jesus died on Passover. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Okay. So Jesus died on Passover, and then once he died, they take him off the cross, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread starts. And then about 3 days later, we've got the period of the first fruits. Now, what are the first fruits? Like, why is that a part of the feast? What does that mean?
Why
does it matter that he died on Passover and rose again on the first fruits? Sorry.
Because it said he would be the first fruits of the resurrection. It's connected to that. But first fruits is the first fruits of the barley harvest, and it's the beginning. We have to remember, and this is another thing that isn't taught in Christianity often, is that there's only 2 biblical seasons. There's the spring season and the fall season. We have 4 seasons on the Greek calendar and the Roman calendar, but in the Hebrew thought and Hebrew calendar, there's only the spring season and the fall season. So in the spring season, you have Passover, unleavened bread, which includes Bikurim or first fruits. And then you have Pentecost, which happens on the 50th day from the counting of the high Sabbath of Passover. And then you have the season of summer that goes on in our time, but it's not actually called a season biblically. And then you have Yom Teruah, or Feast of Trumpets. You have Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement. And then you have Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles, in the fall. So these are like mirror images of events that happen, and two sides of the same coin, so to speak. So you have spring till from Passover to Shavuot or Pentecost, and then from Rosh Hashanah to Sukkot or Tabernacles. And each of those are 8-day feasts. Passover and then Sukkot is a 8-day feast. So spring begins with an 8-day feast and ends with the blowing of the shofar, which is what we hear when God sounds from the mountain, and the Bible says there was a great trumpet that sounds. So it starts with the 8-day feast and ends with the trumpet sounding. And then the fall, we have the trumpet sounding, and it ends with the 8-day feast. So it's the two sides of the same coin, so to speak, of the events that lead us in this cycle of life, because biblically we work in a circle, not in a linear, not in a straight line. So everything is circular and renews itself. So these days were there and established so that we would understand that the first part was fulfilled and the second part will be fulfilled.
Right. So what I like about this, and I'm hoping you guys got some questions here in a minute, but how cool is it that Jesus died specifically on Passover and specifically rose on the period of the first fruits? Something that happened, I mean, a difference of, a few thousand years.
The lamb slain from the foundation of the world doesn't make sense outside of the context of Passover.
Right, exactly. Like, what do you mean he's the lamb? What does that mean? And, you see the lamb in Passover in Exodus whenever we first learn about it. And then Moses gives a more detailed of what you're supposed to do. Now, so Jesus died on Passover, but then you also have Jesus' Last Supper. So what was that?
The Last Supper is a Seder meal. It's a meal that's still done today in Jewish homes all around the world as Jewish people gather together on the evening of the 14th of Nisan. And they have this whole meal that you go through that initially was just lamb, unleavened bread, and bitter herbs. Now we have extended that to have other things that are involved in it that tell the story of the Passover, which ultimately tells the story of the Messiah, because we have the 4 cups of wine, which talk about Messiah. We have the 3 pieces of matzah that are used to tell the story of the matzah, tell the story of Israel, tell the story of Messiah. Each of these different aspects come to us that express the story of Messiah in a full and really meaningful way in Judaism. So every Jewish family that does Passover and does a Seder goes through all these aspects of the Passover supper. And when we look at it, we see Yeshua in every part of it. Yeshua picks up the 3rd cup of wine and says, I will not drink again of the wine until it comes to fullness in my Father's kingdom. That's the cup of redemption, which takes place just before he gives his life for us. These things are really meaningful to believers, but they're lost. It's like the Jewish people have them, but don't fully understand them. And the people that believe in Yeshua or Jesus don't have them, but would understand them if they saw them.
Yeah, and I'll just speak. When I was growing up in church, and I think this is still true of a lot of Christian churches today, the Easter season is mainly Good Friday and Easter Sunday.
Right.
And if Passover is mentioned, it's just, if they're reading the passage about the Last Supper. Mm-hmm. Jesus was celebrating the Passover with his disciples, and then they move on to the rest of the events of that of Friday and Sunday. And there was a church, the first church that I served when I graduated college. We had a pastor there who, for the Good Friday, instead of having a regular Good Friday service, he said, no, we're going to do a Seder meal, which some of the old guard was like, what do you mean?
Yeah.
And it was one of the most meaningful events or services that we had. And do we have time? Can you kind of walk us through the parts of the meal and how that, because there's some awesome parallels there between what God established when he set up Passover originally and how that just parallels the story of Christ's death, burial, and resurrection. He mentioned briefly the cup of redemption, but there's so much more. Like every part of that meal relates some way back to
the cup which I think what you're getting at is the cup that Jesus took when he says, hey, take this. This is my body. This is my blood.
Right.
He was at the third cup, which is the cup of redemption. Is that right, Rabbi?
Correct.
Yeah. And I just think this is so cool because the Bible's already got it set up.
Right.
Why do we have to add outside sources to bring it in?
But at that time, looking around in the fellowship hall we're at, it's almost like you could see the light bulbs go off over people's heads. Like, oh,
and it makes so much sense.
We get it.
Like it's so much deeper.
Right.
But can you still do like Easter egg hunts and stuff?
Go away.
So let me hit on the Easter egg thing for just a minute. So my family doesn't do Easter. Like we just call it Resurrection Sunday. We may call it Passover. We don't like to call it Easter because of the background that it has. And I mean, you got eggs and rabbits, and I'm not gonna go into this of how it's just a pagan holiday and all that stuff, but because it's not just a pagan holiday. We adopted some of the things, and part of the Easter bunny is goddess of fertility, and so rabbits and then eggs.
Oh, we did the same thing with Christmas. It's the Catholic Church trying to appease, or
make it easier for pagans to convert.
Well, and
we've just adopted it over the years.
You see the same thing. How many churches, will put on programs and things just to get people in the door?
Oh yeah, yeah. So Rabbi, if you would, could you explain to us like what each of the three cups are and just some of the significance?
Before I do, I thought it'd be fun to talk about two other things, if you'll let me. One is
go for it.
I'm assuming that all three of you can count to three.
Yes.
Some days
not sure about
some days are harder than others.
Okay, I know. Well, you can take your socks off if you have to, but there's no way to count 3 days and 3 nights from Friday to Sunday.
Right.
It just doesn't work that way. And the problem isn't so much in the counting as it is in Christians trying to follow the Bible using the Greco-Roman calendar instead of the Hebrew calendar.
So let me touch on that before you jump into that. So understanding the difference in the calendar we use today and the calendar that the Jews would use is, and this is very simple, our day ends at 12 o'clock at midnight. Theirs ends at sundown. Like it's when sun goes down, like right now, it's Wednesday, so it's 8:57. According to us, it's 8:57 on Tuesday, but the Jewish calendar, it would be the next day already. Is that right, Rabbi?
Correct. The day begins at sunset and ends at sunset. So when you're counting days, that's how you count it, and then it counts by the calendar goes by. For instance, on Passover, it's the 14th of Nisan. Now, it doesn't matter what day of the week on the Greco-Roman calendar that is, because the Greco-Roman calendar isn't the calendar the Bible goes by. It goes by the Hebrew calendar, which is a solar lunar calendar, which also takes into consideration agriculture. But I don't want to get too much in the weeds on that, but understand that Yeshua died on the 14th of Nisan before the sun went down. So there's a day, and then the sun goes down and it's night. And then we have day and then night and then day and then night. So there's no way you can have 3 days and 3 nights, which the Bible says you have to have. It says he'd be in the ground 3 days and 3 nights. There's no question about how that works between Friday and Sunday. But there is if you go by the 14th of Nisan, which would have been on a Wednesday, then you have Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and a resurrection that happens early in the day. And remember, early in the day does not mean 5 o'clock in the morning. Early in the day in Jewish thought is 5 or 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock in the evening, because the day starts in the evening.
Right.
So when you think about it, he would have resurrected sometime after sundown on the end of the 17th, the 16th going into 17th of Nisan. So
what you're saying is the only way that the whole 3-day Jesus death and resurrection was 3 days is if you go by the Jewish calendar. It makes no sense for us. Because
right, it does.
You're basically saying,
if you try to go with Good Friday through Sunday morning resurrection, you cannot come up with 3 days.
Right.
Well, you got Friday, Saturday, Sunday, but if he died on Friday night and rose again on Sunday morning, well, that's not 3 days.
Right, and you also have to remember that he died on a high Sabbath. They had to get him off of the cross because it was a high Sabbath. John tells us that. And then
what's a high Sabbath? What's a high Sabbath?
The high Sabbaths are the extra holy days like Passover, Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, Shavuot, the first day and last day of Sukkot, the first day and last day of Passover are high Sabbaths. So you have Passover that is from the 14th to the 15th of Nisan, but as soon as the sun goes down, it begins the high Sabbath. So remember, he's on the cross, and they come and tell him, we have to get him down and get him buried because it's about to be Sabbath. Well, it wasn't the weekly Sabbath. It was the Sabbath of the high Sabbath, according to the book of John. So then if it was Wednesday, and then you have Thursday that comes, and then you have Friday that comes, and then you have the resurrection that happens at the end of Saturday, you have the Friday there that they can go shopping for spices. Remember, the women go shopping for spices? So they can prepare his body. But that can't happen on a Friday through Sunday scenario, because if Friday is the day of execution, then as soon as the sun goes down, it's Saturday. You can't buy the spices on Saturday because they didn't do business on Saturday. Then you have Sunday resurrection. There's no time to buy the spices. So there's a lot of reasons that go into the understanding of this. And it may seem like something that's not all that important, but it was important enough for the Bible to mention it.
Yeah.
There's so many things that aren't in the Bible that weren't written, that if something is written, it's written for a purpose. And that purpose was that the times of his death, burial, and resurrection would take place at the appointed times that God established from the foundation of the earth, so that Jewish people would see those signs and recognize their Messiah. When I was a kid, I lived in South Florida, and we used to take road signs down. I know you guys never did that as young people, but we would take road signs down and hang the signs in our bedrooms and stuff as decorations and all that stuff. Well, if you're driving somewhere and someone says drive to First Avenue, and you're driving along and there's no sign that says First Avenue, you may still find where you're going to, but it's a lot more difficult to find. And unfortunately, many people within the Christian church have made it very difficult for Jewish people to find their Messiah, because they've removed the road signs that lead to him Jewish people.
We're not even hitting on that, but that's so true, because like we don't actually make the connections for Jews, because they look at Jesus and the way that Christians look at the Trinity, with Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. They see it as paganism because it's polytheism. It's like you have three gods. Like they don't understand that. It's because of the way we explain it, because we don't connect the Old and the New Testament as well as we should. Not even close.
Well, there's a big disconnect with a lot of Christians. I mean, we've talked about it before, how a lot of Christians say, okay, we have the New Testament, so the Old Testament is rendered
Right.
null and void now that we have the new covenant. But it's like, no,
and
we have to read the whole piece.
We have this weird concept of like the Old Testament is like the old law,
Yeah.
like unapplicable.
It says old.
Yeah.
So it's useless.
Yeah, so it doesn't
except
apply
except
now.
for tithing.
Yeah.
It
He's
seems
very
like
true.
tithing all.
Yes.
We only need the Old Testament to cherry pick the things that we want, like
Yes.
tithing. We need our money, guys.
Or we forget about like like I'm reading through the Old Testament right now, like through this year, and like, man, God, like he, like,
Yeah.
you know, anytime they were doing something like lying one time, or turning around, looking back, salt, and it's like, you know, that's not really seen in the New Testament as much, but there is, like you guys said, there is a big bridge between the Old Testament and New Testament, and then like I'm a result of being a failure to be taught that.
A failure of discipleship.
Right.
As you're looking at this concept of the Old Testament, New Testament, and like was just said, you know, in the Old Testament, there was this God who, when somebody did something, he, you know, zapped them. But just think about the people that said they sold their property in the New Testament
Yep.
and
Ananias
didn't give the
fire.
full amount.
Yep.
That was an instant zap. Okay. And then when you read the book of Revelation,
Smite.
I love that you said instant zap.
which has
I like the word smite.
which has a lot of the same kind of stuff. So the idea that there was this ogre, mean-spirited God of the Old Testament that had no grace, and he suddenly, like 2/3 through the book, decided that he was going to start loving people and giving grace is just really inaccurate when you consider Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. David found so much grace that God did not take his life, even though he was a murderer and a rapist.
Yep.
Okay, so there was a tremendous amount of grace in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament. The problem is that teachers today don't know or teach that, so it's easy to assume that suddenly God had a personality. He had a personality disorder, and he got on Ritalin.
he got fixed. He got on Ritalin. That's
awesome. So he mellowed out. You know, he was this really violent kid who became a teenager, but then they got him on Ritalin and he chilled out. And the New Testament, he was this well-behaved. You know, it's just ridiculous to think that way. But much of the Christian world actually teaches that concept.
Right.
Well, you know, I'm so glad God doesn't, you know, hate sin like he used to. You know, I know, Rabbi, for me, I was recently, I just finished the Torah today, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And when you're reading Leviticus, and I've mentioned this on a previous episode, but the sacrifices and the things that they were told to do were so gruesome. And it would be something, I don't know, I'm sure Rabbi could pick something that seems small, you know, and that God, you know, judged harshly. But there's a specific part where he tells them, put your hand on the head of that goat and slit its throat. Like, that's a big deal. It's not like, okay, I'm going to go shoot this deer from really far away, you know, or like...
Oh, you had to get your hands dirty.
Yeah, you had to get your hands dirty. And then there were kids that were there, too, that would see these sort of sacrifices. And what we need to understand as Christians is, you know, God is not more merciful than he was before. He's just not taking his particular wrath right now. He's waiting for that. You know, he hates our sin. You know, and some people say, well, how could a good God allow people to go to hell? Like, couldn't he just change us and save us or whatever? And it's like, okay, let's look at it this way. How could a holy and perfect God stand to be around something that's imperfect? You know?
Yeah, I would actually contradict you, Wes. I hope this doesn't hurt your feelings too bad.
No, it doesn't.
He doesn't have any feelings.
But I think that as you read the Old Testament, you'll find that in different situations, circumstances, God judged righteously but differently.
Yes.
And so when you look at our world today and you see things that are happening around us, the wars, the violence, the sickness, the destruction, the things happening, you'd be hard-pressed not to see those things as God's judgment on sinful man. We just don't look at it that way because we're taught not to.
Right.
We're actually taught that God doesn't judge us today like he did in the Old Testament.
Right.
But if you look at the Old Testament, they had earthquakes that swallowed people up. Guess what's happening today? Earthquakes just killed a whole bunch of people.
Yeah.
So tsunamis and disasters and things, sicknesses. I mean, how many people died over the last few years due to COVID or various things associated with it? But we're trained not to consider those things in the New Testament period the same way we would look at those exact same things in the Old Testament and say that was God's judgment there, but it's not now.
Right.
And we have to be really careful that we don't, when the Bible talks about blaspheming God, blasphemy is merely making his or changing the way his character and nature is. So when we blaspheme God or we use his name in vain, we tell people that he's different than he is, or we demonstrate that he's different than he is in our minds and our hearts. So when we tell people that the God of the Old Testament was one way, but he's now the God of the New Testament, that actually contradicts the Bible that says he's the same yesterday, today, and forever, and that he's immutable or unchangeable. He changes not, he can't change, that he judges the righteous and the unrighteous, that he gives grace to those or mercy to those he gives mercy, and judgment to those he gives judgment. It's the same God in both parts of the book. We're just trained to look at it differently so that we can, in our minds at least, get away with the sins that we don't want to get rid of.
Yeah, and I think that concept is actually really scary. Just that you said about blaspheming God and just like misrepresenting him, or what the thought that came to my mind was, how often have you heard people say, well, God wouldn't do that. God, that's out of the character of God. I think we need to be very, very careful.
The one I hear a lot is like, well, the God I worship would not do something like that.
Uh-huh.
It's like,
Well, we've also made Jesus out to be like the better version of God.
Yeah.
Like Jesus in the flesh, like manifested, like dwelling among us, was just the loving part of God, and like the wrathful side, like stayed up in heaven, which like Jesus is God. He's man and God.
Yep.
Same thing, but we've kind of made Jesus like more our friend and less of God,
Right.
Which is just like you said, is taking God in vain. Taking God in vain isn't just saying like,
it's not saying
like OMG.
OMG,
Yeah, you can worship in vain. You can, even when you're praising and not really thinking about it, not worshiping in your heart, you're taking the Lord's name in vain.
Yep.
Anytime you lessen the meaning of God and his name and his sovereignty, you're taking it in vain.
Yeah.
Right. And that goes back to this discussion about Passover, because God said, you'll keep this feast forever. And then we tell people, well, we don't have to do that anymore. Which, I mean, when you think about just how serious it is to say God was only kidding.
Oh.
or he didn't mean
I don't
it.
have the bravery to say that,
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, and again, that's aside from doing additional things. There's things that we do that are additional to what God would have us do. It's fine to do more than he says. But it's not fine to do less than he says. And so, for instance, Passover has the 4 cups of wine, it has the bread, it has these things, and the Lord said, you'll do these. And Yeshua actually spoke the words that are printed on the altar or the communion table in churches all over the world that said, as oft as you do this in remembrance of me. But most of those churches never do what it is that he was actually doing when he said, as oft as you do this, do it in remembrance of me. He was having a Passover Seder. He was observing the Passover. He was taking the Passover bread and drinking the Passover wine and saying, as often as you do this, the Passover, do it in remembrance of me. So what the church has done is said, we're not doing Passover. We're just going to eat bread and juice, and we'll do it on Sunday or every fifth Sunday or twice a year or once a year
quarter,
or whatever,
right before
depending on
the
what we want to do. Now, again, there's no problem theologically or biblically with doing more. So if you want to drink some wine or grape juice, I know you guys are Baptist, so it's probably grape juice.
Be careful.
But and have some bread and say, I'm doing this to remember what Yeshua did. That's perfectly fine, as long as it's in addition to doing what he actually told us to do. You know, it's kind of like if your dad leaves the house and says, look, before I get home, make sure you have your room clean. And then you go and clean the garage. And then he comes home and you go, look, Dad, I cleaned the garage. And he said, yes, but did you do what I told you to do? You know, it's nice that you did something extra, but you can't really do extra if you haven't done the first.
It's not really extra, it's just different.
Right. And so what
point.
we've done is we've taken what he commanded us and said, we don't want to do that. So we're going to reorganize it, restructure it, make it a little easier on us, change the meaning a little bit, and then call it communion and make it a new sacrament that's outside of the Bible, because you won't find what the church does as communion inside the Bible. Matter of fact, in Corinthians, when it talks about, is this the communion that Yeshua died for, it talks about people having so much food they're gluttonous and so much wine they're getting drunk. And I've never seen that happen with a little bitty 2-ounce cup of wine, or I mean, even if it's really wine and a little, cracker wafer. Nobody would say you're being mean to the people of God by not sharing your lunch with them over a cracker and 2 ounces of grape juice. It's just significantly different. It's unbiblical because it's not in the Bible, but it's not unbiblical to do it in addition to what the Bible says, as long as you do what the Bible actually says.
When I was doing my master's, I actually wrote a paper on Passover, communion, Lord's Supper. Just there's a lot of different terms for it. And one of the questions that I asked was, when he said, "Do this in a remembrance of me," what is this? What exactly did he mean?
Well, I think you're quoting like 1 Corinthians. I mean, it's like, what is it, 9 or 10, when he's talking about the Lord's Supper and he's saying,
11.
Okay. Is that what you're
He was so close, though, Wes.
Is that what you're talking about?
Keep guessing, you'll get it. Well, no, Jesus actually says, "Do this in remembrance of me."
Oh, she's talking like the upper room.
Yeah,
okay,
upper
cool.
room. Jesus says, hey, guys, do this in remembrance of me.
Okay.
What is this? What is this that he is talking about? Is he talking about, that third cup of wine? Was it all right, here, drink this cup and eat this bread. Just this. Is that what he's talking about? Is he talking about the whole meal that they had?
It's the feet washing.
Or was he even saying, do this in remembrance of me? Was he saying, every single time you eat, every single time you have bread, every time you have juice, wine, whatever you want to call it, do that in remembrance of me. Remember me and remember what I'm about to do for you. Just consider that.
I think, how we do like what we used to until the guy quit doing social media. We used to post the quotes. I think the quote for this episode should be, in the New Testament, that would be an instant zap. Okay, so you've mentioned a couple of times the connection between Yeshua and Jesus, or Joshua. Could you kind of explain that a little bit?
Sure. There's 2 names in the Bible that were fundamentally changed when translating to English. Most names in the Bible, like Moses, is English for Moshe. It's just taking the Hebrew letters and bringing in as close in the English letters as possible. We call that transliterating. So we have like Yaakov becomes Jacob, and Moshe becomes Moses, and Miriam becomes Mary, and so on. But with the name Jesus, it goes from Yeshua, which is, we find that in Nehemiah and Ezra in the Old Testament, the same name. And in the King James and other Bibles, it's translated Jeshua or transliterated. But when that same name was brought into the New Testament, instead of transliterating it from Hebrew to English, they went from Hebrew to Greek to Latin to Germanic to English. So as it went through all of those different stages, it changed from Yeshua, which is a variant of Joshua or Yehoshua, to Jesus. So, and in doing so, it actually loses its meaning, because the name Yeshua actually means salvation. It's actually a Hebrew word that directly translates.
Right.
Or you shall name him Yeshua, for he shall save his people. It's a play on words in the language. Okay, but when you get to Jesus, Jesus by itself has no intrinsic meaning to that group of letters put in that form. It's 5 languages away from the original language. The only other name in the New Testament that has a similar thing done is James. The book of James is actually the book of Jacob, because Yeshua's brother Jacob, or Yaakov,
it calls him
in
Yaakov.
Hebrew. But it's made James in the New Testament. Now, James, it goes through a similar situation to get there, but it also has the emphasis on James connecting to King James, who wanted his name in the Bible, and that was a good way to do it.
Now,
so Jacob can become James through the transliteration process, but it's not the normal way to get there.
Right. Now, I think, when you say that, King James wanted his name in the Bible, is that speculation, or do we have sources on that?
Yes.
Wait, to which one? You want fries or tater tots with that? And you said yes.
I said yes on purpose. There is some translation evidence that puts it that King James wanted his name in the Bible, but there's debate about it. So it's not something that we can say for sure. Okay. But what we can say is that particular name was uniquely transliterated differently than every other name, and the person that paid for that to happen happened to be named James.
Yeah. You got some decent evidence there.
So that's why Yeshua, which means salvation, that's the name that Miriam and Joseph, his parents, would have called him. But let me say this, and I want it to, because this is important. If you're praying, if you're driving down a hill and a car pulls out in front of you and you holler, "Jesus, save me," God is not going to go, "Wrong name, buddy." You crash and you die. That's not his nature and character, right?
Are you sure?
So yeah, I am pretty sure.
Hey, it says by no other name you're saved. That means you better know Yeshua or else.
Right. So, but it is important that when you know what's right, he that knows to do good and does it not, it's sin.
Right.
So once you learn something, then you become accountable for what you know, and then it becomes willful choice rather than ignorance.
It's his fault. He told us. Now
now we can't share the gospel.
We have learned, and now we're ruined. Thanks, Rabbi.
I do what I can. I'm here to help.
I'm here to put more of a burden on you. Thanks.
Wrong name, buddy.
Wrong name, buddy. Sorry, you're
actually
out of here.
all I'm trying to do is unload the burden that you've had placed on you.
Yeah.
I'm trying to make it lighter.
Right.
My yoke is easy, my burden is light.
So just out of curiosity, like, you won't say Jesus, like you'll say Yeshua.
I say Jesus all the time.
Right. So like
when I'm teaching or something, I'll use the Hebrew Yeshua, and then I'll let the people know that means Jesus.
Okay.
This is the person as Jesus. His name is Yeshua, and then I'll use Yeshua. because I know that that's what his name was. But I don't condemn or say that somebody is ungodly for using Jesus. It's just that name has gone through such a transformation that it loses some of what it is, which part of that is that Yeshua was Jewish. He came from the tribe of Judah. He was a Jewish king. He was the Jewish Messiah. And if you take the Jewishness away, you end up with an open door for Greek translation, interpretation, and understanding.
And then you miss stuff. You miss more context.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. And I know you guys are not King James only because I listened to the podcast about that. But do you have a King James Bible with you by any chance?
I try not to.
This is an NASB.
I've got a box of them in my van up at the top of the hill.
Well, I'm just saying, the King James Bible, because this links us back to Passover, the King James Bible in Acts 12:4 translates the Greek word Pascha as Easter. It's the only place in the Bible the word Easter is, and it's only in the King James Bible that I'm aware of. There may be another one, but the one I'm aware of is King James. All other Bibles translate it Passover because it's the Greek word for Passover. It's the Greek transliteration of the Hebrew word Pesach. And we'll start at actually verse 1, just for context.
Okay.
Now about the time Herod the king stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church, and he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword, and because he saw it please the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter also, and were the days of unleavened bread. And when he had apprehended him, he put him into prison, delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people.
All right, now what is just do that last part.
Yeah, mine
Eli.
says squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out before the people.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, why would they put Easter there when it's clearly Passover? Why would you? Easter it's nowhere in the Bible. It's nowhere in previous texts.
When was the English word Easter even a thing?
So I don't actually know the full etymology of it, but I know that it's the goddess of it has to do with the goddess of fertility, which is, I believe, Ishtar. Is that right, Rabbi?
Okay, actually,
go ahead.
There's 2 thoughts on this. One is what Wes is saying, that it comes from the goddess Ishtar, which is a pagan goddess of fertility and was worshipped at that time of the year. The other is that it's just the translation of Eastern, which is where the celebration, saying it was the Feast of the Easterners. Either one could be correct, and it really doesn't matter. The point is that the King James Bible anachronistically inserts Easter into a text where it was Passover, and they did that purposely to take Passover out of that celebration. In other words, the purpose was, we're replacing Passover with Easter, so that when you think about this time, you'll think of Easter instead of Passover. And it's the de-Jewification of the good news.
So, really quick, because I want to clarify something. If you're reading the KJV, we're not throwing shade on it. We're just being honest. And this is an issue. And if they did that with Easter, what else did they do it with?
Right.
And we need to be very, very careful about what we're reading. I know there's going to be a lot of people that don't like that. King James is it's the only inspired word of God that we have. And I get why people say that. I think, but to say that you should throw it out, I would never say such a thing. But if anybody would, not that anybody's asking, but if anybody wants to know our preference on what you should be studying, it should probably be the NASB, the New American Standard Bible. That's the main one that they know. I know you got the Tree of Life Bible, Rabbi. The Tree of Life Bible is actually really cool. It's why don't you just explain that, Rabbi? Tell them about the translation that you've got.
Okay, the Tree of Life Bible is a Bible. First of all, there are only about 6 fully vetted Bible translations that exist. And when I say fully vetted, it means that more than one person looked at the text, translated the text, and worked together, more than just a couple of people in a room somewhere. Most Bible translations that you have, one person sat down, translated the Bible, and handed it out, and people accepted it as a translation. The King James is one of the vetted translation. The NASB is one. There's the ASV is one. There's some good, solid, vetted translation. In other words, somebody translated it. Other people looked at it to make sure it was valid, correct, and so on. So the TLV is a Bible. It was translated by Messianic Jews and Gentiles to work together to bring a balanced translation to the text. The reason I say balanced is because when we read the King James, you heard where it says, "This pleased the Jews." So it makes it seem like every Jewish person was pleased by that. Well, if you know anything about Jewish people, there's nothing that pleases every Jewish person. If you have two Jews, you have three opinions. It's not the way it is. It really was Judeans, and it was the people, the ruling party of Judea that was at the temple that were pleased by what was happening. Not all of the Jews. There were thousands of Jews that believed in Yeshua, followed him around, were his followers, his disciples. So, but when you translate it the way that certain Bibles are translated, they choose words that bring about certain thoughts or understandings, like putting Easter into the text. The TLV did its best to not do that. So it uses Hebrew words where only, like shalom is a Hebrew word that can't be translated by one single English word. So it has shalom in there, and then it has in the glossary what that word means. But there's only about 50 Hebrew words that are used that way in the entire Bible, because we didn't want it to be overbearing and hard to use. But the names of key figures like Miriam and Joseph and Yaakov or James, the person you call James, and so on, are Hebrew because their names actually had a meaning, and we wanted people to remember that Yeshua's family were Jewish people, not Roman people.
Yeah, and
not English people or Europeans.
Yeah.
So that's important. It also uses the name Yeshua. It uses the Hebrew order of the books, because the Christian Bible ends with the book of Malachi, the Italian prophet.
What?
Did you not get that?
I didn't get the joke. I'm sorry.
Malachi, the Italian prophet. It's Malachi.
Oh, okay. Malachi. All right, I'm with you.
Okay, so
Thanks.
Where the Hebrew Bible ends with Chronicles ends with a blessing on the Jewish people. You turn the page from Chronicles to Matthew, and it's one consistent story of God's blessing and provision. It leads us from the promise of Messiah to the Messiah. Where in the Christian order of the books, it ends with a curse on Israel. Mm-hmm. So when you turn the page from a curse on Israel, you have the church replacing Israel and this new group of people that God is loving on and keeping, rather than his chosen people and the ones he made a covenant with. So there's things that really are done in the text. For instance, in your Bibles, the headings. You know that headings aren't anointed, right?
The headings are extremely dangerous, in my opinion.
They are, because they make you think. For instance,
they give you the main idea of the story.
Right, they give you the idea. You read the heading, and then you read the text through the lens of the heading. So
almost bad as
those
chapters and verses
lead you to believe something. Like, for instance, in your Bible, in many Bibles where it talks about the Last Supper, it'll talk about establishing communion, or Jesus establishes communion or something like that, when he didn't at all do that. But that's interpreting the text instead of translating it, and it's interpreted by those divisions. So I know that's a long way to say the TLV is a really good translation of the Bible. It's not perfect, but it is a very good translation. It's good translations of the Bible are about 70% accurate. And when I say accurate, I mean word for word accuracy. The more direct translation, the more accurate a Bible is, the harder it is to understand, because when you go from language to language, you have to add words in order to make it make sense.
Yep.
And if you read Greek, for instance, the Greek order of the words, go in the order of the importance of the word, not in the order of understanding the word. So when Yeshua said, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do, in the Greek, the order of the words are, Father, forgive them not, they know what they do. Okay, but that's not what he was saying. It's just the order of how Greek words go.
Right.
So in order to, if you just word for word translate down, it would change the actual understanding of the text.
It would change the meaning like a lot.
Right. So then you end up with, on the other side of things, paraphrases or dynamic equivalents, which are translating phrases or thoughts rather than word for word. So a good Bible, like the King James Version, which is a decent translation except for the mistakes, the ASV, the NASB, the TLV, they're all about 60 to 70% word for word, which is a good solid translation.
Awesome. So we need to. That's all of that was fantastic. I like how you guys put the order of the Bible in a way that actually makes more sense. Like pretty much, and this is just a quick way to kind of understand how the Bible's put together. As far as regular Christians go, or Baptists, I guess, or Protestants. That was the word.
Yeah, there you go.
Basically, you've got the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, and then after that, they pretty much go. I think it's like history, and then it hits like it has poetry and prophets, major and minor prophets. Minor prophets are just the shorter books, and then if you look at the New Testament, it's basically you got the 4 Gospels, and then it starts out with Acts, which is written by Luke, and then all the books that Paul wrote, and then it changes authors after Hebrews and so on. Which is a fine way to put it together, but if you don't know that, you might read something into that Bible that's not supposed to be there.
Right, and you might read the Bible as if the books were in chronological order.
Oh, yeah, they're not even close.
Because they're not. Job happens way back in early Genesis.
Right.
So when we read Job late in the book, people don't think this happened way back before Abraham.
Well, the first book in the New Testament that was written was what, like 1 Thessalonians and then James?
I think James was the first one written.
Those are way back in the New Testament.
That's like 40 AD, I think, is the earliest.
Yeah. Well, and like 1st and 2nd Corinthians actually would be separated. They weren't back to back. Like Paul wrote one, handed it, and then wrote another one or delivered that one right after.
Well, he wrote one, and then he wrote 2 more, which is we don't have the first one.
Mm-hmm. What a shame.
All right, so that was excellent. Thank you, Rabbi. Well, we've had a good conversation so far about Passover and different clothing and spots.
We really have, and Rabbi's given us a lot of good information, some stuff that I didn't know about, and some things I kind of had an idea about, but he clarified a lot of things. And I know there's still a lot more to come, so we're going to cut and make this a 2-part.
Well, there's a lot. There's a lot in this first episode, just because. I mean, it was just a pile of information. I mean, I myself, I need to go back and listen to it just to hear,
just to digest.
So hopefully, other people will do the same.
Yes, and so come back for part 2 next week. We're going to continue this conversation, and there's a lot more good stuff to come.
Listening. For more information on DDS Faith Ministries, please visit our website at ddsfaith.org and follow us on social media. Thanks.